the Democrats really are getting quite nervous. And he sent me a very alarming note, which started with the words, "I think he will win."
Is this potentially the moment where Netanyahu changes direction? What is the end to this? And what is it that he's keeping going, trying to do?
It's just going to take 2 or 3 of these prisoners who've been released early to do something really terrible when they're out, for that then to sort of come back and hit them in the face. This episode is powered by Fuse Energy. And Fuse, Rory, they are at it again. They've got another giveaway for anyone who switches their electricity at getfuse.com/politics and uses the referral code politics.
5 lucky switchers will win a copy of our books, Alastair, and we'll even sign them with a personal message too.
And that means if you've got children, we can do children's books. And if you've got adults, you want an adult's book, we do adult's book. And this is a great time to think about changing your electricity supplier to Fuse, because as of October the 1st, the energy price cap has gone up again. Average annual bill up 10%.
And Fuse's tariffs are cheaper than any of the big 6 competitors. So hopefully you'll be able to save on your electricity bill this winter if you switch. So go to getfuse.com/politics now to find out all the details.
And Fuse are a green electricity supplier. They generate power from their own solar and wind farms. They invest 100% of profits into building more renewables. So they really are trying to make a difference for the planet.
So download the Fuse app now and crucially use the referral code politics after signing up for a chance to win our books. Deadline for entry is 3rd November. Visit getfuse.com/politics to learn more.
It takes just 3 minutes to download the app and sign up, and Fuse will handle everything with your old electricity supplier for you. That's getfuse.com/politics. Welcome to The Rest is Politics with me, Alastair Campbell.
And with me, Rory Stewart.
I just picked up The Economist, and the front cover of The Economist this week is the American economy being, quotes, the envy of the world. And I'll just read you this little paragraph from the main editorial. In 1990, America accounted for 2/5 of the GDP of the G7. Today it makes up half. Output per person is now about 30% higher than in Western Europe and Canada, 60% higher than in Japan. Mississippi may be America's poorest state, but its hard-working residents earn on average more than Brits, Canadians, or Germans. The reason that sort of leapt out at me is because we keep hearing that one of the reasons why Kamala Harris is not right out ahead and why Donald Trump might still win is because he's making hay about the economy being weak. And yet you read this and you think, well, what is the disconnect between economic data and real people's experience?
And do you think it's getting worse? Because, of course, your friend Bill Clinton was very much part of this whole generation where it was all about the economy stupid. But I am always a bit suspicious of this because the big macroeconomic data often conceals how people on low incomes are actually experiencing things. So, for example, in the US, even as inflation comes down, inflation has hit very hard cheap goods more than expensive goods. So people shopping for basic groceries in Walmarts, paying for their gas, are feeling it more. There's also the sense that compared to where people were in the past, incomes have been stagnant. So you can see interviews with people pointing out that their daughters are earning $15 an hour working in Walmart, and they were earning $15 an hour working in an automobile factory in Michigan in the late 1970s. There is a possibility that the New York Times and The Economist will keep writing articles saying, well, we don't get it. The headline data is terrific. And that this doesn't really reflect what many Trump voters are experiencing.
Friend and former colleague of mine, Peter Hyman, is engaged in this major project trying to work out how progressives can better tackle populism. So he is currently traveling around the United States, going to Donald Trump's rallies. He's interviewing dozens and dozens of these people. And he sent me a very alarming note about his experience, which started with the words, "I think he will win." And that is not an uncommon thing. I'm getting a lot of messages at the moment from people who are really, I said squeaky bum time. I think the Democrats really are getting quite nervous. Now, that's inevitable this close. You get nervous unless you're 20 points ahead in the polls. But Peter makes the point, first of all, that inflation has been really, really bad for a lot of people, and it's really damaged the Democrats because they've been in power. Trump still gets marked up because he has this image as a billionaire businessman. And the stuff about him going bankrupt 7 times, it all just sort of adds to that sense of he's like, he really gets the economy. And she comes over as being a lot less interested. He says that all the kind of crazy stuff that he does, it's almost like it goes over their heads. They don't really care. And they know that he's a liar. They know, I'm quoting him now, that he's an asshole. But there's something about him that they forgive him. Also, the other thing that he says that's really interesting is that the whole thing about there were no big wars when he was president. And it seems like under Biden, we've got the Middle East, we've got Ukraine, and why are we always at war? And so this sort of feeling that there just sort of, it didn't matter what he said or what he did, these people are going to vote for him. Now, these people are the people who are going out to rallies.
Yeah.
That sort of underlines their support for him. But Peter's a very bright guy. He's very good at analysing opinion, and he is definitely of the view that this has moved away a bit from Harris.
So there are two things. One is that we know, of course, that the strong Trump base has remained unmoved and remains very fiercely for him. We also know there are many people who are just Republican voters and will continue to vote Republican even if Trump is the candidate, which is why we come down to this cliche that the whole thing depends on 7 states and might even come down to a few 10,000 votes in Pennsylvania, and why turnout becomes essential. I remain confident that Kamala Harris is going to win and win by a comfortable margin. And as I think I've said to you before, I believe this because I think what's happened is the polling agencies have panicked. And it's not surprising they're all hovering around 50-50. They're hovering around 50-50 because they like to be in a pack, and 50-50 is a pretty safe place to be. I think that the turnout assumptions on Trump don't make sense. I can't see young African-American voters who say they support Trump necessarily turning out to vote in the polls. And this is something that the Mooch has pointed out, that he doesn't really have a ground game. He doesn't have what the Democrats have, which is 300,000 volunteers to actually get people to the polls. He's very dependent on his social media status. And he certainly doesn't. The Republicans have no ground game at all in African-American communities in central Michigan because those were traditionally Democrat voters. So they simply didn't have any infrastructure there. But you're right. I'm increasingly a lonely voice on this. And The Economist and most of the American newspapers are now saying that Kamala Harris will win the popular vote. But it looks increasingly as though Trump is going to take the key states and win the presidency.
I mean, I guess we're at that stage where it's probably best just to ignore everything because we don't know. The polls are so knife edge in these swing states. So I guess we're just at that stage now where the important thing is to try and work out what their closing messages are as they zone in on these, as you say, this very small number of swing states.
So she's changed her strategy, and one of the changes is that she went out and she did Fox News interviews as talk about her doing more and more conservative podcasts. Having done a bit of a Keir Starmer, Ming Vaz strategy, she seems to be now getting out on the front foot. What was your sense of her Fox News interview, how that went?
I thought it was good. I think you're right that there's been a slight change. And yesterday she was on the campaign trail with Liz Cheney, Republican daughter of the former Vice President Dick Cheney, who is, according to the Mooch, is number one on Trump's post-election hit list if he wins. The Mooch is number 48. He was very
because Liz Cheney was one of the few Republicans to come out very strongly for impeachment after January 6th and has been a very strong critic.
Yeah, and also she did an event with Liz Cheney. She did 3 events through the course of the day, but one of them was with undecided voters, which I think is a good thing to do. I think actually being seen to be with, not just being seen with your own people the whole time. The Fox News interview, I thought she did well. There was a lot of satire around it because the interviewer, Brett Baer, was like, he was far more aggressive with her than he had been in the Fox News era ever with Trump. But she was very calm, didn't sort of lose her rag in any way, pushed back pretty hard. I think she has stepped up. But I tell you the thing I do worry about is that, and she had this message, and I think this was a very deliberate message. My administration will not be a continuation of Joe Biden, which I understand why she's saying. But I think that there hasn't been much defense of the record, and that's what's allowed Trump to sort of make this claim that the economy is not doing well, that people aren't better off than they were. But at least you had a sense of her with a closing strategy. I mean, so far this week, all we've really got about from him is that he's obsessed with the size of Arnold Palmer's penis.
Hmm.
That was a really, really weird one. And Arnold Palmer, the golfer, his family have come
Yep.
out and said he didn't like Trump at all. And then yesterday, this really weird visit to McDonald's where he was pretending. He got so triggered by the idea that she worked at McDonald's or says she did.
Hmm.
He then
Hmm.
says she didn't. So now he goes and works at
I'm
McDonald's.
looking for a job, and I've always wanted to work at McDonald's. I never did. I'm running against somebody that said she did, but it turned out to be a totally phony story. So, President Trump! Well, that's a good-looking group. Hello, everybody.
Crazy.
I'm having a lot of fun here, everybody.
It turns out that the place was closed down. The people who who were customers in quotes were all sort of vetted by the campaign. So they came along pretending to be totally surprised. Oh my God, Donald Trump's serving at McDonald's.
Look at that. Look at that. How are you?
Thank you, Mr. President.
Nice to see you.
I once tried to do this in Cumbria, and certainly I was told by my local McDonald's franchise that I wouldn't be allowed to do it because I hadn't passed the food safety training. So I was very intrigued watching this, whether, in fact, McDonald's would permit him to operate the fryer. All these trivial things, Arnold Palmer's penis, or they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the pets, the people live there, are very good ways of distracting from bigger allegations. For example, from one of his former most senior aides coming out saying that he believes that Donald Trump is being blackmailed by the Kremlin,
Yeah.
is suddenly put on the same level as were the people getting the fries from him actors or were they real people? So it is literally this dead cat strategy again and again, even when it comes down to the triviality of him doing the cat stuff, that you just can't distinguish with any of these people. They're sort of, well, they're firing chaff, aren't they? I mean, so that you can't.
Yeah. Just on the Russian, the compromat thing, which comes out of this Bob Woodward book. So he's quoting, or seems to be quoting, senior generals, people who are part of the military establishment, who are essentially saying that Donald Trump is kind of under some sort of weird influence with Putin. I can't, for the life of me, understand why the Harris campaign hasn't at some point persuaded these people to go out and do a big event, to do a press conference, to call in the world's media, and for them, if you put together all the people who work for Trump, most of his cabinet, Mike Pence, ex-chiefs of staff, people like Scaramucci who worked in his comms team, you put all these people together. Just imagine the effect you could have if you not just doing stuff on social media, but a massive press event, get the world in, and have these people saying, this man is a threat to America. He's a threat to American
You're
security
absolutely
and
right. And it
democracy.
would be very powerful, wouldn't it? You could almost actually summon his whole cabinet because his whole cabinet has turned against him. You could have the whole cabinet with an empty pod at the end and they could all
Yeah.
talk frankly about what he'd been like to work for.
Now, maybe they won't do it. Maybe Liz Cheney is the only one that's kind of, got the guts to go and do it. I don't know.
We hear a lot about Russian election interference, and it's often quite non-specific. But if people are interested, Microsoft Threat Analysis Center has released details. This is September 17th report that I'm reading on specific accounts from Russian bot farms. So there's something called Storm 1516, which is a Kremlin-aligned troll farm, which has put out videos depicting an attack which pretends to be Harris supporters attacking someone at a Trump rally. And then another uses an on-screen actor to claim that Harris was involved in a hit-and-run accident and was laundered through a website masquerading as a local San Francisco media outlet. There's so much sort of strange conspiracy theory about this, and it gets into the realm of watching Homeland. But it's worth, for people who are interested in the details, reading these Microsoft accounts because they actually specify how these videos are created, who's creating them, how they're disseminated, and the fact that they're getting millions of views. And of course, some of this stuff, not those in particular, but other pretty implausible stories are of course circulated very easily by Elon Musk. So you'll often get millions of views on stuff that he's sharing, and he's now relentlessly using his enormous platform on Twitter. I mean, this is why I think he's almost like a media baron from another age.
Oh, yeah,
using
totally.
that platform to promote Trump again and again and again.
And also promoting conspiracy theories, pushing fake stories about Harris, pushing fake websites, and also this incredible thing where he's giving $1 million a day to people who sign up to this super PAC thing that he's got on the First and Second Amendments. And very, very hard to understand why that is not akin to buying votes. You're giving people financial incentive.
Exactly. The point is the First and Second Amendments are code for supporting Trump's position. And so you're basically getting yourself involved in the Trump campaign, and this lottery pays out to one person a day $1 million. So there's now very serious attempts to challenge him for breaking electoral law for doing this. But this is big money going to try to arrest people.
Let's say that Trump narrowly wins in the Electoral College. And we know that if Harris wins, even if she wins big, Trump is going to challenge the result, refuse to accept it, and provoke all sorts of trouble on the streets, etc. But let's just say Kamala Harris challenged that, a narrow Trump win. Then this could become the Musk interference. And I notice he's now sort of trying to backtrack slightly and say he sees this as making them ambassadors for his PAC. And that's why they need to be paid. It's like a salary. And the thing about Musk, I think this is what happens with these sovereign individual types, is that they think they are above the law. So he probably won't even have sort of worked through whether there might be legal problems in what he's doing.
But before announcing that the whole thing is terrific, yeah.
Yeah.
Brief reminder of what's just happened in Moldova. There's just been a referendum on accession to the EU, where a victory in the referendum means that an addendum to the constitution will commit Moldova to push ahead with its EU accession. And Moldova, December end of last year, began its accession negotiations with the European Union, meaning that there are now a group of countries, Montenegro, Serbia, North Macedonia, Turkey, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and Bosnia, which are theoretically in accession negotiations to join the EU. It's leading then into an presidential election for Maia Sandu, the pro-EU leader of Moldova, and then parliamentary elections next year. Give us a bit of a sense of Maia Sandu, because I believe you know her.
She's very, very smart, very clever, from a World Bank background, so would be very much put into the sort of globalist camp. She's in her early 50s. She founded this Party of Action and Solidarity. I don't know her well, but I've spoken to her a couple of times in relation to the campaign that she's been running. And I hadn't, when I first spoke to her, and she talked about the way that Russia was essentially trying to sort of, take over the campaign of her opponents. I'd wonder whether there was a little bit of kind of, exaggeration or even paranoia about that. But this has been quite incredible. So in a country of just over 2 million people, they have spent, it's reckoned, about $100 million in trying to influence the outcome, both of the referendum and of her presidential election.
The Russians, through a oligarch called Elon Musk, who's a Moldovan Russian oligarch who's now, I think, in refuge in Moscow. And Moldova is a sliver of territory between Romania and Ukraine. So in a sense, it's sheltered from Russia by Ukraine, from Russian tanks rolling through.
But it has this Transnistria, this sliver down the side, which essentially is a breakaway where there are Russian troops present. They reckon around about 130,000 Moldovans. That's about 10% of the turnout essentially were bought. So, and it nearly worked. I mean, we talk about 52-48 in the Brexit referendum being very, very close. The yes vote to change the constitution got literally just a fraction over 50%. Where I think it becomes much more difficult now, though, is that Maia Sandu won the first round. She topped the election first round with 41%. But her opponent is this guy, Alexander Stoyanoglu, who's a former prosecutor. And he is very much the Russian camp. And a lot of the smaller parties who have been eliminated in the first round are likely to come behind him rather than her. So it's not impossible that even with that 15% lead in the first round, it's not impossible in the second round she could lose. And then, of course, and she essentially is saying she is absolutely clear that this has been criminal groups working with the Russians to try to buy the election. The BBC had a reporter out there who actually came across a woman who came out of the polling station and said, "Right, where do I pick up my money?" Because she said she'd been promised money to vote, and the guy who'd promised it, miraculously disappeared. But she's incredibly brave, Maya Sandu. I mean, it's a tiny country, very, very poor, and she has absolutely been standing up against this relentless campaign run out of Moscow to basically to topple her.
Which I guess brings us to the bigger strategic picture, which is that the European Union has a big strategic choice, opportunity, challenge in how to deal with many of these countries which are hovering on the edge of Russian influence. And to some extent, they've let down Moldova because they haven't provided enormous economic support. They haven't provided the economic stimulus that could have really allowed Maya Sandu to demonstrate real economic success in Moldova. It wouldn't be very expensive, actually, in a tiny country like that. My friend Gerald Knaus, who I keep quoting from the ESI, has been pushing for Moldova to be allowed into the single market, along with Ukraine and the Balkan states, because EU accession is getting more and more complicated. So joining the EU fully getting more and more complicated. But it would be possible to grant them the 4 freedoms of the single market. And that's something that happened with Finland, Sweden, and Austria before they joined the EU, and would be a real way of putting an economic shot of the arm, showing seriousness.
On that point, von der Leyen, the Commission President, has put forward this near €2 billion financing package. They're going to be receiving tranches of the money every 6 months, conditional on making the changes necessary for accession. So I think belatedly, they are addressing that point.
The European Union's in a very difficult situation because there are, of course, big anti-immigration moves, a lot of hostility, obviously, towards Turkey joining the EU, largely because they don't, many countries don't want Turkish migrants coming in. But at the same time, a lot of people in Brussels understand that EU membership is the single biggest incentive they can offer to people to enter the more Western liberal democratic orbit and detach from Russia, which, again, as I say, just brings us to Georgia. So Georgia is a country on the other side of the Black Sea, so on the northeast edge of Turkey, the kind of top right of Turkey. And there we are also going into an election in which the Georgian Dream Party, which is the ruling party, which is financed and run basically by a man called Ivanishvili, which is pro-Russian, is running a very anti-NATO campaign in which it's basically suggesting that the opposition will drag Georgia into some war. They show big posters of Mariupol in Ukraine, shattered, and saying this is what Georgia will look like if these guys win. The likelihood from the polls, although we're all pretty skeptical of polls, seems to be that the Georgian dream is likely to be defeated. But they, again, are up to real monstrous stuff. So the bodyguard of Ivanishvili, a real sort of thug, has now been put in charge by the party of supervising the elections. And both parties are playing for EU accession, but the Georgian vision of EU accession from the Georgian dream, from the pro-Russian party, is, yes, we'll join the EU, provided the EU is much more like Viktor Orban's Hungary.
Yeah. Although there was an incredible pro-EU march in the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, over the weekend. I mean, huge.
It was really dramatic, wasn't it? Yeah.
I mean, the Georgian dream, in a way, they try to have their cake and eat it. They sort of say that they're pro-EU and pro-NATO, but as you say, then they apply all these kind of conditions. And of course, they're also, where they're following Orban, is also in relation to some of the stuff they've done on curbing LGBT rights, which is very much part of that kind of right-wing populist playbook. Also, these massive protests when they were bringing in this foreign agents bill, essentially to try and stop any media and NGOs with foreign funding from operating unless they were in support of Georgian Dream. And so you've got this billionaire, very pro-Russian, with a kind of placeman prime minister, Koba Kiche, and he is driving a very different agenda to the one that maybe publicly is being put out to candidates. And they've been in power now since 2012. So I don't know. You say the polls suggest they're not going to win. I'm not sure. I think they probably will win. And I think the support they're getting, again, through Russian financial support and political support, is huge. And when you think about it, we still haven't got to the bottom of Russian interference in Brexit. We still haven't really got to the bottom of their interference in the Hillary Clinton-Trump election. I mean, they are all over these elections. And you had this situation this week where Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, under parliamentary privilege, naming people like Tucker Carlson and Jordan Peterson as Russian assets, paid Russian assets. So, the idea that they're not interfering in democracies is for the birds.
Just to finish this half maybe with a gloomy note, we've talked a bit about the risks that if Trump wins, if Putin were then to be given much more of a free hand in Kiev, you can very much imagine Serbia trying to do stuff in northern Kosovo and Republika Srpska. You can imagine Azerbaijan reclaiming its ambitions to what it calls West Azerbaijan, which is a bit of territory in Armenia. All of this stuff is connected and is very, very sensitive. When we think about domino effects, when we think about Russia-Ukraine, we tend not to think through the micro details of what can happen in a lot of these states and what's at stake here.
Well, the Moldova presidential election, the second round, is November the 3rd, and the Georgian election is this upcoming Saturday, 26th of October. So a lot going on in Eastern Europe, watched carefully by the European Union and by Vlad in the Kremlin. A couple more of your heroes have been very majorly in the news. First of all, not far from where you are, your friend King Charles being subject to this lone protester, calling him a genocidal conqueror of our lands. And then more importantly, David GAUKE, your number one hero, has now achieved something that you've been desperately trying to achieve, which is get a job with the Labour government.
It's amazing.
What do you say about the King, first of all, and then what do you say about David GAUKE?
So, as you say, I'm in Australia, and the King is also in Australia.
I bet you're meeting up, aren't you? You're meeting up.
No, I'm
You
not
are.
meeting. He's got better things to do than meet me when he's in Australia. He's got a lot of Australians to meet. No, I think that the tour has been very well received. It's on a smaller scale, I think, than a royal tour probably would have been 40, 50 years ago. But there's not much sense, at least amongst people I'm meeting, of strong Republican sentiment. There have been crowds out to meet him. As you say, in the Canberra Parliament, there was a protest by a leading woman from the Aboriginal community who talked about historic wrongs. But other members of Parliament then spoke out and said that they felt that she'd been impolite and were much more respectful. I think people have been struck by, certainly people around here anyway that I've been talking to, struck by his energy. I mean, he has just been recovering from chemotherapy. Just how much he is demonstrating again and again his affection for Australia. He spent a year here as a student, which he talks about a lot. And no, I feel it's interesting that whereas republicanism probably would have been more of an issue here 10, 15 years ago, it doesn't really feel like that. It was a big, and there was a very, very warm article in the Australian newspaper yesterday by Alexander Downer, the former foreign minister.
Oh, he's a right old right winger, he is.
He's a big, big royalist.
He was one of the few Aussies who was in favour of Brexit. I went right off him then. Rory, I know you're obsessed with hair. Okay.
Yes.
I do think if you can maybe drop your friend the King a message, I think he needs a little trim. He's gone very thin on top, but he needs a trim round the ears. It's just, he's developing these curls. What's that all about?
Oh, well, goodness gracious me. Okay, well, there we are. I'm not sure I can raise that. Now,
Good.
David GAUKE, quick explainer, has been put in charge of a review of sentencing. So David GAUKE was my boss when he was Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice, and he and I tried to push through a reform to abolish sentences for under 6 months for people who'd not been involved in violent crime, and that is because I was finding people in Bedford prison. I found a man who'd been in prison it was something like 7 times in a year because people were getting sentences for a few days at a time, which was only long enough to disrupt their lives, lose them their housing, lose them the job if they had one, and then they were popped out in the street again. And actually, these short sentences contributed to so much violence and instability and reoffending.
Mm.
So we tried hard to get rid of them, but in fact, Boris Johnson got in the way. The Theresa May government fell. David and I left our positions, and that reform didn't go through. So it's interesting that Labour's now appointed him to this role because it suggests they may be interested in bringing that back in again.
Well, I think a combination of James Timpson as the prisons minister, who is a very, somebody who's got a track record of having a very rehabilitative approach to prisons, and David Gauke, as you say, somebody who with you tried to change sentencing in a way that would see fewer people going to prison. That is a very, very clear direction to travel. And it coincides today, Rory. I don't know if you've picked up this where you are, but the government is going to be releasing another 1,100 prisoners early because of the current overcrowding. These are mainly, I think, going to be coming from open prisons. So they've been maybe working more towards rehabilitation anyway. But it just shows you the extent to which there is an absolute crisis in our prison system.
And showing some courage on Labour's part, because I remember talking to the shadow team when Labour were in opposition and trying to encourage them to push ahead with this. And a few months ago, they were very reluctant to do it. They pointed out that it was one thing for David Gauke and I to be pushing ahead with this under a Conservative government because, in a way, Conservatives can be more liberal on prison because they're less likely to be criticised by the opposition. And they said that if Labour were to do it, they'd be accused of being weak on crime. And you can see this already, that a lot of the Tory leadership candidates have been majoring on the fact that people were released from prison who reoffended and then had to be put back in prison again. So I'm impressed that they've pushed ahead with that and that they've decided to do something liberal on that. And I hope they keep their nerve.
Yeah, it's very interesting, this thing, though, about how long a government has it to as it were, to say we're dealing with the mess that was left behind. I mean, I think on prisons, people get it. But I was at a conference the other day. I did 2 conferences in successive days at the same event. One was on health and one was on education. And I got the feeling that people are already, it's almost like they're already forgetting that Labour was only elected just over 100 days ago. The sense of, when are they going to get on with it? So like West Streeting yesterday announcing there's going to be a 10-year plan for the health service, which I think you and I agree it needs that sort of long-term approach. But much of the response was, we can't wait 10 years. We've got to do this now. We've got to do it now. And I think that's going to get very, very hard very, very soon. It's why I wish to God would get on with this budget and the spending review, and we could start to see some real signposting of where the money's going to go.
Yeah, I mean, you keep pointing this out. This 4-month delay to the budget, given the budget is critical to their narrative, is very dangerous. Just on the politics of this, they are going to spend political capital on this sentencing review. And I wondered whether that means that they have less appetite for taking risk on things like reform of the NHS, or whether you think they're not incompatible.
I think my sense of West Streeting is that he really is up for some pretty big reforms. So no, I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is more in relation to the prisons issue. I think it's in its own separate category. It's just going to take 2 or 3 of these prisoners who've been released early to do something really terrible when they're out, for that then to sort of come back and hit them in the face. But they just have to keep explaining the reason why they're having to do this. So no, I don't see that as the problem. Now, shall we just briefly close off with the Middle East, Rory? Because that was pretty dramatic stuff last week.
Obviously, the really big news this week is the killing of Yahya Sinwar, who was the head of Hamas and has been for more than a year the number one target of the Israeli mission. He was a man who came from a family originally displaced from Israel during the Nakba, during the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians at the time of the creation of the State of Israel. Grew up in a refugee camp, studied in Gaza, was arrested very early on, joined the armed operations in Gaza very early on, was held in Israeli prisons and established a lot of his networks and reputations in prisons. And this is very common. I mean, this was true with the IRA, wasn't it? That a lot of the key commanders created a lot
Yeah.
of their networks and credibility when they were in
He
prisons.
was in prison for 22 years.
It's a very,
There's a
very long
guy who's
time.
in prison for a long, long time.
He was released in this famous hostage swap where a single Israeli soldier who had been captured was released in exchange for over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, of which Yahya Sinwar was one. And this is also important because this is in the back of the story of why particularly the right in Netanyahu's government are very reluctant to do hostage deals again, because there's perception that terrorists were released. He was the mastermind of the October 7th attacks, and therefore very much core terrorist. I mean, he is, as it were, the Osama bin Laden of this whole setup. He was the guy that drove, planned, and executed that attack. Now, the question then that immediately struck everybody when he was killed is this potentially the moment where Netanyahu changes direction? Does he say, okay, I've now killed Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah commander. I've killed Yahya Sinwar. I've killed Ismail Haniyeh. Over 40,000 people have been killed in Gaza. The Hezbollah leadership has been wiped out by these pager attacks and radio attacks. Mission accomplished, and we're now going to move to a new stage. But of course, that is not what he's done, which raises a question: what is the end to this, and what is it that he's keeping going, trying to do?
When this happened, and there's extraordinary footage of him sitting there in a sort of rubble, in a house, but it was kind of a house that was clearly sort of very badly damaged, and he's sitting in a chair, and his hand looks like it's been severed, and he throws a stick or he throws a piece of wood or something at this drone camera. It was unbelievably dramatic, and then of course the body gets taken away by the Israelis. They do this DNA test. They confirm that it's him. Then Hamas confirms that it's him. And you did think for a moment maybe this is the point at which they can say, well, we said we were going to obliterate the leadership. We've now done that. Since when, actually, they've gone, it seems to me, in an opposite direction. They're actually maximizing it. There was a remarkable report on Channel 4 News last night of a gathering of settlers, and Ben Gvir was there. And it was almost like there was an interview with this guy who essentially was saying they want to move back into Gaza. They want to live in Gaza. You sort of had a sense of Netanyahu trapped by these forces. Essentially, he's got the international community on one side trying to do one thing, and then this hard right, Ben Gvir and Smotrich in particular, essentially saying, no, you can't do anything until we've absolutely wiped these people out. And that sort of gives you the feeling of it's impossible to see how this now ends, if that is the mindset that is driving them, not to see that there may have been some possibility of trying to work towards a solution of the current crisis.
Yeah. I mean, the sense is, I guess, that Netanyahu must feel over the last few weeks that he's, as it were, on a roll. Because
he is on a roll. Militarily, they're on a roll,
yeah,
no doubt about
absolutely. I mean, because the operations against Hezbollah were so successful, and now the killing of Yahya Sinwar. But it seems to me this is the high point of the roll, and that's why I think it's dangerous. There's something very strange about keeping pushing on, because what more can you achieve in this light? I mean, what's next? And I think the sense is that you could be doing, I suppose, one of two things. You could be trying to reinforce deterrence. In other words, saying, if people attack Israel, we hit them back very hard. That, I would have thought, has been amply achieved. If that's what they're trying to do, nobody's in any doubt since October the 7th that Israel hits back very hard and kills a lot of people. The second idea that by continuing, you're going to be able to lead to all the hostages coming back and all the Hamas remaining people involved in the attack being eliminated, that seems to make less sense to me because I can't see an unconditional surrender. I mean, it's almost as though Netanyahu's trying to suggest that it'll be like the end of the Second World War, that you'll have some generals turning up and signing a bit of paper and saying, we give up. It's not how terrorist organizations operate. And therefore, what's likely to happen is Israel will find itself conducting military operations week in, week out for the foreseeable future, presumably through a US election, hoping for a Trump election. And what does that mean? Well, then it feels a bit like the situation Israel got itself trapped in Lebanon in the 80s and 90s.
The war aim, they said at the start, post October 7th, was to eliminate Hamas leadership. But there will always be a new leadership. There will be no shortage of people who will want to step up and say that they are the leadership of Hamas. And likewise, when you just have to look at, even though no foreign media are allowed into Gaza, but you just have to see the pictures that are released by the IDF to understand that the place is being reduced to rubble.
Yahya Sinwar's death has real operational significance. He clearly was very important in the running of Hamas. There are eyewitness accounts of him meeting the hostages. He was clearly very involved in the attempts to get ceasefire negotiations together, talking through intermediaries, even with US negotiators. And of course, when Ismail Haniyeh was killed in the inauguration in Tehran, he then took over a very centralized command of Hamas. But I think there are two buts. One of them is that he will have been very aware that he was going to be killed sooner or later. He was killed not in a tunnel far underground, but above ground, with only 2 or 3 people with him. Piecing together the accounts from the Israeli battalion, it appears that they went into a building above ground when an Israeli battalion was operating in that area, came out into the open when there were a lot of Israeli soldiers around, ran across an open space. He then went up into this building which you've described, threw a grenade, one of which exploded and injured an Israeli soldier, another one of which didn't explode, was then hit by a tank round. As you say, a drone went in. He covered his face, tried to throw the stick at the drone, presumably hoping he could disable the drone so they wouldn't recognize who he was, and then raised his head and was shot in the head by a sniper. But that is a very, very strange exposed position for a military commander to be in. And he's been saying, he's been saying for some months now that he was expecting to be killed. So I guess all I'd say from that is there will be some kind of succession plan in place. And just before I come back to you, I mean, it's also important to understand that Israel has not done very well in penetrating Hamas. It obviously understands Hezbollah very well. Its operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon were incredibly effective, and they had a lot of information on where Nasrallah was based, and they did these extraordinary things around pages and radios. But the failure to predict October the 7th, which had been planned for months, showed they had very little intelligence penetration of Hamas. They have, a few months ago, the IDF suggested they thought they'd killed Yahya Sinwar when they clearly hadn't. And the fact that he was eventually killed basically by accident by a relatively low-level unit that caught him in the open reinforces the sense that we don't really know what is going on in Hamas and what happens when he leaves.
I think the fact that he was killed, as you say, above ground, in the way that he was, kind of fighting to the end, not hidden away in the tunnels, which is what everybody had thought, sort of adds to the martyrdom, the hero status and all that within his own people. And that, I suspect, will further fuel the sense that there will be succession and there will be a new generation. So do they just keep wiping out the new leadership as they replace them? Does that just become a kind of permanent war?
Which is the expression, isn't it? Just before you go to find mowing the grass, which Israeli intelligence and the IDF often use, which is that you just keep taking the leadership out.
Yeah. And just a couple of my final point, Rory, just on the sort of state of devastation in Gaza. There was a United Nations assessment which reckons that 2/3 of all structures, including more than 250,000 housing units, have sustained at least some damage. And almost as many buildings have been destroyed or damaged in Gaza as in the whole of Ukraine after the first 2 years of the war with Russia. And that's a research project done studying satellite imaging. And remember that Gaza is tiny. It's less than half the size of Kyiv. So you're talking about a scale of devastation that is absolutely enormous.
Well, we'll be able to get into many other parts of the world and many other issues. And thank you for your time today.
See you soon. Bye.